Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin, so please find your way to your seats.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Sorry to interrupt these really what sound like vibrant conversations. Good morning. Good morning. Hi. So for those of you that don't know, I'm Marjorie Sims. I'm Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute, and it is just my honor to serve in that capacity. And how about we first and foremost give the parent panel another round of applause. Thank you. It was so very important to start with the voices of families, to start this convening in a way that really grounds all of our conversations. I would simply like to welcome you this morning. You're going to have an amazing day. I know that already because you're amazing people. But as we get started, I simply want to just introduce Reggie Bika, who is an Ascend Fellow. He's going to do some welcoming remarks. Reggie.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Did y'all have a nice evening? Yes. How many of you is your first time in Aspen? Wow, a lot of people. Is this not like the most beautiful place on earth? Qualifier, most beautiful place on earth without an ocean. I mean, fair enough. It really is. I moved to Colorado about 9 years ago. My wife, Becky, and I, and every time I make the drive from Denver to Aspen, it just takes my breath away. I was saying to my wife, Becky, did you ever, in your wildest dreams, think that we would have the privilege to live in a state as beautiful as Colorado? And my wife, Becky, said, Reggie, you're not even in my wildest dreams. All right. Good morning. My name is Reggie Bika. I currently serve as the executive director for Shine Early Learning with my good friend and boss, Henry Wilde. Henry is also here this morning. Henry and I are what I call OFs. You've heard of OGs. We are OFs, Original Fellows. We were both members of the inaugural class. Before joining Shine, I served as the executive director of the Colorado Department of Human Services for 8 years under Governor John Hickenlooper, and it was during this incredible experience that I had the opportunity, the true privilege of getting to know our leader, Ann Mosle. So when I came to Colorado, Governor Hickenlooper laid out a bold vision for our state. He said we needed to connect the needs of employers to the skills and capacities of parents needing employment. And not just a job, but a good-paying job. He said we needed to find ways to close the achievement gap for young children, particularly those who were coming from poor families, had brown or black skin, or who spoke English as a second language. He said that we needed to help dads stay connected to their kids and to tear down crazy bureaucratic barriers that serve to keep parents apart from their children. And he said that we needed to do these things by investing in and building local communities, not state government. And then he looked at me and he said, you can do that, right, Reggie? And I said, as any good new cabinet member would say, of course, Governor, we can do that. And then I went back to my new office and said, how the hell are we going to do that? Then, as is a gift from the anti-poverty gods, Ann Mosle came into my life. She offered this amazing plan to establish a fellowship program through the Aspen Institute on an idea known as 2Gen. She asked me to be a member of the first class. The fellowship and Ann's leadership gave me a framework, a safe environment, and a set of amazing compadres to learn from, to think with, to understand the movement to prosperity differently than I had before, and to take new risks. We got to ask questions like, what if we changed child support services from enforcement to engagement and helped non-custodial parents get a home, an income, a relationship with their child, and the child's other parent? Could we achieve better results? We wondered, what if we focused on employment outcomes at the same time we paid attention to that ridiculous work participation rate that the feds tell us we have to measure? And we made those employment outcomes around how many people actually get a job, what are their earnings, how long do they stay in that job or advance in a career? Could we actually get people meaningful employment and move them out of poverty? What if we focused on getting more children from low-income families into high-quality early care and education by investing in and strengthening the existing child care community and accepting that child care is a work support and an early learning strategy, and stop the decades-old argument of one over the other? What if we truly engaged and listened to parents that we serve by creating a family voice council, paying them for their time, just like the rest of us were getting paid, and took action on what they actually told us? Could we make the system different? I could truly go on and on with the paradigms that we challenged in our crusade to address childhood poverty during those 8 years. It was the support, guidance, and solutions that and Ascend offered us in Colorado that allowed us to make great strides toward Governor Hickenlooper's daunting vision and to change the conversation in our state and a few other states along the way to two-generation strategies to end poverty. Our leader, I like to call her the godmother of two-gen. They told me I had to be serious. And I said to Ann yesterday, seriously, you're going to ask me to speak for 3 minutes, which has never been done before, and you want me to be serious. You clearly should have asked somebody else to do this. The godmother of two-gen is a visionary, a national leader, a network developer, a catalyst, a problem solver, and a nurturer of souls. Souls of those working to leave poverty and find true economic prosperity. And the souls of those professionals and caregivers who are working fiercely to help families move out of poverty. Ann started Ascend in 2010. She was recently recognized by the American Public Human Services Association, where she serves on the board, with the Friedman Award last year due to her outstanding leadership on two-gen. Ann Mosle is my friend, my mentor, an inspiration to me and to many of you in the room. Please give it up for the godmother of two-gen, Ann Mosle.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Reggie. That was pretty. Thank you very much for your incredibly kind words and your friendship, and most importantly, for your leadership. I've learned so much with you, and it's been an incredible journey. Good morning, everybody. We have a big day ahead of us. So the next couple of hours is going to be a chance for us to do a little bit of story sharing, do a little bit of just kind of capturing a bit of what we've learned and what's happened over the past 9 years so that we can kind of get a little bit on the same page about this two-gen journey and what it really sets us collectively up for when we think about what does it mean for us to really advance powerfully, authentically, an equity-based family prosperity and well-being agenda for 2020 and beyond that puts children and families at the center. And we're going to have a chance, after we do a little bit of that, to then have some incredible experts. They're going to walk us through a bit of a landscape, and both from a racial wealth gap analysis and also look at some narrative work and bring in some public health perspective. And we sometimes like to call that the brain candy piece of this work, to then sort of fuel the conversations that are going to happen. So part of what I wanted to share with you a little bit was, and I was so inspired last night by the beautiful panel and just the resilience and the brilliance, as always, of the parents. And I just, and as a parent who every day is somewhat making it up and faking it as we go through, and my kids are now 19 and 17, and I think about where they were in this journey as we passed through. And just sharing a little bit of the story of how Aspen got created, just transparently about where, why, and how. And then share a bit about just what were the lessons from then and now, and just share a bit of the footprints of impact. And the thing that was extraordinary was I kept trying to capture it. And it was a disastrous failure to just get it so they could fit anywhere near the time limit. And then I was like, well, that's a foolish exercise, because that's why we have like a whole week for you all to animate the work you've been doing, because the success and the footprints is what you're all doing. So I'll just give a little bit of the taste of what have been the accomplishments and from the then and now. And I share all that to just bring it on. I can't wait to hear comments, where we missed it, where there's more, where how do we even think about capturing it. And then share a little bit where we see some of the 2-gen operators and accelerator spots to just put the gas pedal on and push forward for sort of now forward through 2020 on. And then we really have an extraordinary opportunity to think about the 2-gen approach and how that really fuels a larger conversation around family prosperity and well-being. And the thing that I'll just say in that, 2-gen was always an approach. It is a mindset, it is a way of working. It is not an end in itself. And so we'll talk a little bit about that aspect. So one thing, and this is a dangerous thing, it's the first kickoff. Close your eyes for a minute. Imagine a world where every child that is born loved, healthy, held, with their parents, with their family, waiting to roll into multitudes of learning, culturally joyful, resonant, responsive, exhilarating opportunities in home and community and institutions and schools. Imagine those parents, mothers, fathers, aunties, grandparents, friends, prepared, ready, respected, stable, learning, growing, thriving themselves, all together in a beautiful home. Everything from the moment it's happening to it's going on to going on forward. Think about our services, from the prenatal visit to the hospital or the care of choice to the transportation to whatever comes next, but the services, the organizations, the systems, the structures, our world, all putting children and families at the center, and all doing it equitably, respectfully, and effectively. Imagine that. Imagine that world. Okay. We can have that world. We can have that world. We have the resources to make that happen. We need to make sure that they're getting there. We need to make sure that the practices and the wisdom and the intention and the will are there to make that happen and come together for all kids and families. And so that was really kind of a simple driving force for why Aspen got created. I've been sort of swinging at these fences for about 20 years, give or take, maybe give. I'd like to say take. And I've had the chance to work really grassroots. I've had the chance to work in everything from the District of Columbia, working directly for tribal nations. I've worked in practice, policy, philanthropy, big and small. All of it has had the North Star of building family economic security. And so when I had the opportunity in July of 2010, Sarah took me back when she was like, oh my God, 9 years ago, of course, 9 days, swam by. It was a very intentional decision to come to the Aspen Institute in July of 2010. and it sort of, my introduction happened here during the Ideas Festival, which some of you may know. And the Ideas Festival is kind of the sort of biggest public event we have here. It's a little bit like the World Economic Forum in summer, but a little bit less security and not quite such a big deal. But it's like Aspen Institute on steroids. And I say that because one of the gifts, like everything, you have the light and the dark side, the good and the bad. Aspen for good, and for sort of can be a challenging side, has an ability to reach the influentials, the affluentials, folks with resources and decision makers. And I thought for the work that I wanted to do and that I could help bring was, how do we make sure there's a lot of good folks doing a lot of great work? How do we make sure this kind of work, creating an intergenerational cycle of opportunity that can pass from one generation to the next, how do we make sure these ideas, this kind of leadership, is getting out to new audiences? How do we go beyond the choir? And so coming here, it was a very intentional perspective to have that opportunity to bring it to Aspen. There was another piece that came to that. One was, if we're going to look at how to do this cross-discipline work, to work across communities, to work across research, practice, policy, systems with leadership, the world did not need another organization, did not want to create the resources to look at that, how to build off the platform of another entity so the work could really be focused outward into the innovations across the country that were happening. And then third, and this is something that I do hold deeply, that I think of the Aspen Institute that is really the best of the essence of Aspen, was the creation and the fundamental belief based on the Socratic method. And love or hate some of the Western canons, the ultimate piece of the Socratic method is about living an examined life. And I talked about this a little bit when I alluded about how we do the work of equity, doing the work from our inward journeys to our outward journeys. And really, at the most basic level, it's how do we live an examined life and carry that out through to how are we questioning the structures and the institutions also that also we live within. And so those are some of the pieces about sort of why and how Ascend, as kind of you really began as a family economic security program, really came to get started here at the Aspen Institute. And the one other thing that I'll just share about myself that really brings myself to this work, and I really want to go into then talking about Ascend, was, and I really want to thank all of the parents last night, but Ebony and Drayton, you really spoke directly to me when you talked about, sort of the words of, what happens when people aren't looking? I've personally had a fair amount of privilege. Hello, white woman, get all that. But I've lived at different ends of the economic spectrum. I've been at the top end, and I've been the type of shoots and ladder, lose your house, whoa, shit. This is a very different world. I am profoundly aware of how people treat folks when folks aren't looking, and who's up and who's down. I go street, I pay attention. And there's a way of how we think about that in power and credibility and who voice matters. And so I just want to say to Drayton and Ebony and to all of us, I'm with you, I hear you 500%. And that's a key part to how we think about these strategies and being authentic about this work. So let me now get to the story about Ascend and really kind of how we started. I'm going to really try to hit the headlines. Because all this work will be animated out. But it's important because it's one of the things because in some ways it's about how an idea turns into action and kind of becomes a movement. And it's really what all of you are doing in your own work. And I think, because part of it was, I said I've done a lot of different things in my life, but my last gig before I came to Aspen was I worked at the Kellogg Foundation. And I was an executive there, and I oversaw a lot of people and a lot of money. And, philanthropy sometimes, not for anybody in this room, but sometimes when you're philanthropy, everybody thinks you're really funny, you're really smart, you're really pretty. Not for anybody in this room, just me. And so when I came to Aspen, I was kind of like, okay, who's still going to be my friend? And some people were obviously like, what's she really doing? What's up? And of course, we did a lot of interviews with folks about what's going to happen. And they gave, real comments. But what we did that was really important, and like all of you guys, we started with a conversation, going out and holding convenings with people to ask people across disciplines, about what does it look like when we think about breaking the cycle of poverty and creating this opportunity through a two-gen lens. We did targeted research with different partners. We held roundtables. One of our first ones was down in Austin, down at the Ray Marshall Center with Chris King. We connected with on-the-ground innovators like Cap Tulsa doing some cutting-edge work, like Jeremiah Program, like Endicott, which were cutting-edge on-the-ground programs, really not trying to be up here like, hey, this is pie-in-the-sky stuff. How is this working on the ground? But then also really doing the focus group work directly with parents, mothers, fathers across race and ethnicity. So from the beginning and throughout, we're talking about real dreams, hopes, aspirations, keeping it real. That kind of worked from the beginning, and it was a mighty little crew, including Sarah Haight and myself, and a big shout out to Nisha Patel and Michaelia Davis, who were core parts of this work, working from the beginning with partners to sort of set the conversation. And after that work of really listening and convening, we put out a very clear theory of change that was about catalyzing a new conversation that was authentically grounded in family voice, that was thinking about how do we be more holistic and thinking about children and the adults in their lives. How do we build a national network of two-gen leaders, have a new approach to leadership, and then elevate where do we see practice and policy solutions. So when we think about this work, just a little bit of then and now. The network that we started began with 58 organizations in 24 states and had 1.5 million families. We now have 400 organizations in 48 states, DC, and Puerto Rico, reaching 5 million families. And this isn't just some network. Like, this is a network when it gets called, it moves, people pay attention, and it is authentically connected. When we do webinars, which started like, it's lifting up work, they're 1, 2 a month, it is on the most relevant issues, anywhere from 200 to 1,000 people signing up that are people from the White House to parents to state directors to practice leaders. It's a real knowledge movement network. It's also a network that moves network to networks, whether it's thinking about the Ascend network to the Prosperity Now network, or thinking about other kind of entities, or Ascend to 0 to 3, like how are we leveraging out networks to networks as well as within. But second, we had a really important vision around leadership. And this isn't something we talk as much about, but we wanted to have, when I came back to Washington from Michigan, I was still stunned, and this was like 2010, 2011, how white all the rooms were. I was like, really? And I was like smitten with the mitten in Michigan, so that's a whole other talk. But I was like, in DC, really? And I wanted to make sure, how do we set up, where were the leaders that represented the full talent that resides in our country, that were also the leaders of the levers of change? And that this was a time when we had the Great Recession, so there's a lot of paralysis about like, what can we do, what can we move, we don't have any money, what's going on? But if you remember back then, the folks that were on the ground, they were doing double time. They were doing double time. So we looked at putting out who were the leaders that were sitting on big ideas with a two-gen approach that were making it happen, and looking at how they reflected the components, like who are the leaders in human services, post-secondary, early childhood, health and well-being. And so from that early vision, and as Reggie cited, the inaugural class, it was a robust class. They jumped in full force, because that was like the definition of building the plane, flying it, and recruiting the passengers. But get the leaders that were going to help lead the way. And so right now we have 60 leaders at the national level, and our first state pilot in Colorado that are now sort of pushing out this framework. And if I could ask the fellows that are in the room to please stand. Yep, get up, folks. These are folks that you'll get a chance to meet with and hear with going forward, but the thing, I'm just gonna do one example because I would get in trouble. There's so much more there leading on different change elements. But one of the breakthroughs, so I'm trying to cheat and condense some of this, but one of the breakthroughs that we're all building on as we think about what has resulted in the past even 5 years has been around brain science. So when we think about brain science, and I'd also say behavioral science, but on brain science, a lot of work great work done about the brain changes happening in kids. Prenatal to 3, it's happening, even up to 5, and then a lot of folks, and babies, Myra, Jones-Taylor, 0 to 3. And as Myra would also say, and we know because of the work of Dr. Sarah Wadamora, and as she would say, her whole team at the University of Denver, because of her Ascend Fellowship and the work she did with her lab, they went back and sort of pulled out their research looking at the biological and neurological change that happens in parents' brains at the birth of a child, both for mothers and also for fathers. There is rewiring that happens at that sensitive period that says, if we think differently about how we connect, how we support, we can have fundamental different impacts. And if we think about home visiting, when I think about Darius Tandon, formerly with Baltimore and Johns Hopkins, now over in the great state of Illinois and Northwestern, but some of the work he's done also around home visiting. And we think about home visiting, a lot of people think about that as parenting, but also a lot of those moms and also dads say at that time, we want to know about education and job training moments because that motivation is happening. So looking at those kind of fellows, how they are breaking open and accelerating new parts of the field. So the one other thing I'll just say, we've also been tracking the public support for this work bipartisan, and even from 2012 to 2018, we have seen bipartisan support for two-generation approaches go up from 70% to 81%. I mean, this is a foundation we have a lot to build on. The only other piece I'll share, because just gotta keep going, is we've also been looking at, and there's been a working group, but really thinking about two-generation outcomes. How are we thinking about also building the outcomes framework? And the huge shout out goes to Marjorie Sims on the Ascend team, who's really led the deep work with a robust working group to think about the data outcomes, the process outcomes, to bring people around so there's a way that we're far beyond 1,000 flowers blooming. We're about really thinking about North Star outcomes, leadership, culture change, field change. So when I think just very briefly about the points of acceleration and opportunity, from the beginning, we had a real priority around looking at where does policy, practice, and research hit the ground. So we've really focused in on looking at state change. State change is when you make decisions, it hits the ground, policy implementation, systems change coming together. And so we had a cohort of states that are now kind of really working, 12 to 14 over the years. Many of them are here. We're going to have a session on it, but Hawaii, Washington, Tennessee, Connecticut, I'm going to get in such trouble. Georgia, Colorado, Maryland, I'm in so much trouble because I've definitely forgotten, and Utah. But there's so many others. But one of the core parts of that strategy was looking at the health and human services anchor. That if we could look at reimagining that as the cradle, within that agency or agencies, because everybody's structured a little bit differently, the child and the adult services, to really come together with a two-gen approach, early childhood, workforce, food assistance, job training, and not have families hopping through that, but really put them in the center, how much more effective could we be and do that culture change? And then also think about how are we connecting with community, like in Tennessee, the great work with human services and Agape, saying let's work together to take the best of public sector and nonprofit innovation and others. And then also bringing in family voice. We've seen, shifts with federal government and regional administration, and Minnesota. Oh my God, Minnesota, so sorry. I'm looking at Minnesota and their whole two-gen learning community. We've seen the regional administrators at ACF, or the Department of Health and Human Services, and a shout out to Michelle Duran and Elaine and Nikki and Carlos, who are all here. And we've worked with every single regional administration office that is has been trying to say, how can we help support some of the state work and try to remove barriers when possible? And so just trying to think to be as effective as possible about looking at how public resources can be working for children and families. And so the last thing, just giving you a sketch where this has had, again, very pragmatic focused, very much with an equity focus for us and putting children and families at the center. When we think about the federal landscape, this started in 2012 with the Obama administration. It has been heartening to see at a very pragmatic level when we think about in health and human services, which is where we started, because that's really, I think about the Administration for Children and Families as the cradle for a lot of the two-gen programs, and Head Start certainly being one of the originators. But having it written into the strategic plan of ACF in 2012, but it's still continuing on with rural impact, into thinking about TANF and Head Start coming together, into thinking about how HRSA is thinking about alignment of childcare and early childhood and health and human services coming together in new ways, and the children, and also thinking about the Maternal Child Health Bureau. There's a lot of great work happening there to be built upon, as well as also the Department of Labor, which is coming to the last end of their family strengthening $53 million investment, looking at community colleges. So I just put out there's a lot between county, state, and federal that we can work with. One other area I just want to share, and I'm going to go a little bit over, Eddie, but keep me on 5, is there's one of the profound shifts, which is really important, has been the shift on parents and the adults in kids' lives. One of the things, and Yvette Santos Fuentes will, I think, nod with me on this. When we started and we think about early childhood, a lot of folks in early childhood were like, oh, this is so great. It's going to be more parent engagement. Kristen Bernhardt's nodding at me. More parenting engagement. Yay, more family engagement. And I'm like, we're talking about respect for parents. We're talking about parents' education, economic support, and their health and well-being. And yes, more whole family support. And that's also going to be better for kids. And that has really been exciting shifts in the early childhood field. And I think it's also shifting to new opportunities in child welfare. But just to name it, when we talk about equity, and I've been a little bit in the early childhood space, which I love, and there's a lot of really shiny, cool innovation, so much innovation. But when you talk about why we're not supporting the adults in kids' lives, that comes down to race and equity and a lot of discrimination. And so when we talk about like what's happened to the adults, that's what could happen to the kids. And so the issues around the transfer of trauma, toxic stress, and how we support whole family, this is a really important shift. And so I think that's something to keep working on and embracing. And so it's been really exciting to think about how we're going forward. And so when I think about this shift in respect, there's a couple concrete ways that we're going to also be working on going forward. And so one area, and I have to do a big shout out to our partners at the Omidyar Network, Venice, and I don't know if Isabella's been here yet, but they've been really partners with us, with many others around thinking about, as early childhood funders, to really kind of embrace a two-generation approach and partner with us to double down on accelerating post-secondary success for parents and really name it. And to really, and there's been other partners, IWPR and Los Angeles Valley College, and just, I'm gonna get in trouble again, because there's so many other folks. But to really make visible, there are so many student parents in higher ed that are doing amazing work. And how do we support, it's like the next step in post-secondary. And so we are gonna be looking at, we are launching an initiative that's gonna be looking at how do we do policy, system, and structural change, and also lifting up parent voice to accelerate that, both as we think about what are credential attainment, but then also learning and earning opportunities. And so one of the things will be, when we think about activation of fellows, we're gonna be launching a pioneer leaders piece for all those higher ed leaders like Paul LeBlanc, president of Southern New Hampshire University, Felo Matos Rodriguez, Chancellor of CUNY, the largest higher ed system in the country, to his son fellows, put them to work with 18 others to help drive this change home. Just showing you how the network comes to action to make stuff happen. But one of the things that was also really important about this work was we've also had a cohort of parent advisors. And at a high level, this has been an extension of how we bring parent advisors and experts into all of our work. But one of the things that we did with Omidyar in this work, which was the next stage of work, you'll see more, was as we brought the parents in, we also worked with Omidyar to develop a methodology about how we also start paying parents compensation for their expertise. And this is something we've been pushing public sector partners, philanthropic partners, and really thinking about this as a methodology. And so this is something we invite you all to come in, because we are not anywhere near where we all need to be yet. And it's something we're also going to take it a step further to create and pilot a parent-powered solutions fund that will be a model also for philanthropy, and I also hope for the public sector, about how do you really create a model that puts resources with the hands of parents to really identify the solutions that they see as the answers. So And so those are just a few of the other pieces that we've got where we see some really great points of acceleration. So as we move forward, we have had in 2017 and 2018, we had a chance with a really fantastic partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to create a very intentional innovation community on family prosperity. And this was building on the work of a two-generation approach and really called a question about, is there an appetite? Is there an opportunity to think about the intersection of economic security and health and well-being? For decades, as Kilolo and others know, there have been people working on the issues of economic security, workforce, a deep, deep body of work. There are some new opportunities. How do we think about how that connects with health and well-being? And one of our biggest learnings, just also the past 5 years, has been this explosion. And this is not the message way, I'm just going to be straight, around mental health needs and the amount of pain and trauma that is out there across this country, and how we think about this coming together in ways that you can be in the workforce world, but if you are not steeped in mental well-being, reduction of stress, understanding of trauma, you're not going to necessarily be effective in your jobs. And so this opportunity we have with Robert Johnson to bring together about 16 partners that were some of the leading policy folk who didn't necessarily know each other, agree with each other. We got to the point where we all liked each other. No. But it was folks that were working on some of the areas where we wanted to really kind of shake it up, where you had leading folks like the Urban Institute, Family Values at Work, AEI, the National Partnership for Women and Families. You had a core group of people who've been working on these issues, and then you had Center for Public Justice, which was a newer organization to us that was doing a lot of work on the sacred sector. But bringing folks together who did not necessarily all know each other or had the same point of view, but were deeply interested in the issues of what would it look like to have family prosperity. We then also brought in network partners who were doing extraordinary work on the ground. Like Aisha Nyandoro, another one of our fellows. A lot of people are talking about guaranteed basic income. Talk, 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 talk. Aisha's making it happen on the ground in Jackson, Mississippi. There are other folks that are sort of saying, this is what it might look like in Minnesota, or this is what it's looking like in Ohio when we're talking about the work or the piece, or there was, but trying to close that gap between national dialogue and happening here. And so we built this community around, we said we want to make sure we're building on what we know is the deep body of work. We're going to look at innovation, families at the center, and really think about equity and lift up what is deep knowledge and work. We also had a group of advisors that tapped everything from leaders from WeWork to FedEx, to like Maria Gomez from Family, Mary Center, thank you. And is Maria here yet? Did she fly in? Good morning. Hello, need my coffee. But flying in, but to bring in everything from the ground, we brought journalists, but to really, we had brain scientists, we had Elder Shafir from like behavioral scientists, so we could go 360, so we could really push ourselves to test our assumptions and see where we could go. And it was great because as we looked at it, we had a chance to really sort of say, we saw real change, and a lot of this was driven by the advocates that were making it happen, where we saw a change where the reintroduction of the Family Act in Congress, we saw 3 states passing paid family leave measures. We saw 10 states passing paid sick leave, 8 states increasing minimum wage with the hope of really moving it towards providing a livable wage. So concrete action with also people thinking about how are we thinking about childcare, which is really the new healthcare issue, but in an economy that is 24/7, how are we balancing issues of flexibility and control and really pushing out? And it was interesting, the one last thing I'll say as I close out was having the employers at the table, because cracking the nut of employers and workforce, this is part of the next body of work we have not cracked. But having even Gina Adams, who is not the urban Gina Adams, who is here and who is fabulous, and so is the other Gina Adams, but we had some really robust dialogue as we came together in the after the passage of the tax thing. I'll be polite. I have my own point of view. And so, one of the opportunities was how is the tax cut being reinvested? And so one of the things on a good side with FedEx was Gina Adams, who was a very senior executive, went back to Federal Express and did a whole audit of what their reinvestment programs was and could be, and had a profound mind shift moment that was like, I now listen to the jobs numbers that come out every month differently. Who are they? What are they? And so I just share that as a little glimpse of like the kind of change if we're also going beyond the choir of how we're building different partnerships. So, that's just a body of work. We have an index that's in your packages that captures the resources from this phenomenal group of folks that goes deep on the issues, everything from the issues that have been deeply out there, from paid family, medical, sick leave, to pregnancy, to discrimination, to new areas where we're innovated. Take this, add more. We're still kind of finalizing the portfolio of solutions and ideas. This is something we're going to be building on and growing forward. But it is an exciting opportunity, and I think it's also really critical for how we think about how we all play bigger. How we all play bigger. Because the last thing is, as we think about this work going forward, we have so much more power than I think we remember. So much more power. At one of our last family prosperity gatherings, we had a very Republican pollster come present to us. And he presented data that was also kind of connected to a very, very Democratic, progressive pollster, where they both agreed on the sleeping giant of the voting bloc that did not vote in the past midterms were basically non-college educated voters. It was basically if those folks without, high school or less, if they show up, they could be the future of the election. And if those folks are able to vote, get to the vote, and actually have an agenda that is helping everybody thrive, it's an incredible opportunity. So we're about to move into the brain candy section, and I'm just going to sort of bring one of my favorite heroes, James Baldwin, is his quote where, when we think it's not possible or we have the tough days, those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by others doing it. So let's get to some interrupting, and let's get to the next conversation. Are we all good? Okay, so we are going to jump right into this wonderful brain candy session where we have three amazing leaders and three amazing women leaders to really kind of lay out the prosperity landscape through a lens of equity, demographics, and families. And I'm just going to do light introductions because you have their bios. And I'm just going to introduce them in the order of their speaking. We have Jennifer Richardson, who is the Philip Allen Professor of Psychology at Yale University. Jennifer is probably the coolest MacArthur Genius Award winner that I've met. I was like, wow, you're super humble for being a genius. She's also for our Maryland partners. She's from Baltimore, so we're kind of claiming her back in the DMV. She recently got an honorary doctorate at Brown, and she also got this, I'm going to mess up the formal title, but this award of being like an amazing, like
mentoring and the student teaching award, which I think is like kind of cool because sometimes you become a really big hotshot and you forget about the students. And so you're just, I think just her work is outstanding, and we'll hear in a moment from her. Kilolo Kijijak, oh, I knew I was going to do that.
Kijakazi.
I knew that, and I know that. So Kilolo is also a leading policy expert on all things economic security, racial wealth gap, structural racism. She's an institute fellow at the Urban Institute. She is also doing a lot of work besides her deep dive on her own research, but also is doing a lot of work to find those connecting points across the institute at Urban, which is really an incredibly important anchor research institution for all of us in this country. She has had a distinguished career also at the Ford Foundation, leading and funding a lot of this work that many of us have been privileged to do across the country, and also working at other important policy places like the Center for Budget on Policy Priorities, the National Urban League, and other phenomenal places. And then we have Lola Adedokan, who brings her background around philanthropy and public health. She worked at the New York City, she's right now the Director of Child and Family Wellbeing at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, where she's really leading an exciting transformation and rethink, I think, around child and family well-being, but also really from child welfare and from the field of protection to really thinking about prevention, whole family, 2gen, and also through an equity frame, and also thinking a lot about leadership. And what do we think about with leadership and equity and racial equity? She has a background also in research and evaluation and working at the New York City Department of Mental Health and Hygiene, specifically around HIV and AIDS. And so has a public health and philanthropic background. One thing that these three women share, besides being brilliant and fabulous, is all three of you have not only an incredible career of being extraordinarily successful and thought leaders in shaping kind of conversations and fields, both with thought and resources and strategy. You all have really concrete footsteps about how you are mentoring the next generation. And I just think for all of us, how we are all really thinking about the next generation of leaders and activists and scholars is so important. So I just want to thank you for all that you do and turn the car keys right over to you, Jennifer. And here we go.
Okay, allegedly, good morning. I'm actually delighted to be here and really honored to be in the company of people who are doing such important work, you know, in academia. A lot of people, my beloved colleagues, think that what they're doing is really important. And sometimes it is. But it's rare to be in a room where I'm convinced that all the people in the room are actually doing extraordinarily important work. So thank you for letting me be among you for some time. I think there may be a clicker. Is it this thing? Okay, perfect. So today I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the work we've been doing and its implications for how we broadly usher, you know, support for some of the work you all are doing, and certainly to support the end goal of what you're trying to do. So I don't need to tell you in this room, but I will, just to set the stage. The United States has been for some time and is continuing to become increasingly diverse in terms of its racial and ethnic composition. So much so that by 2042, the country is expected to be what's so-called majority-minority, with more than 51% of the population being non-Hispanic or being racial minorities, and 49% being non-Hispanic whites. And although for many people, this type of information is, well, some of us, it's, oh, that's just interesting. Some, this is extraordinarily exciting because the diversity of any unit, whether it be a nation or a company, is something that we applaud and value. For many others, considering this type of change, especially in the context of the United States, is actually triggering of what we call racial group status threat. So in lots of work in my lab, in my group, and many others have shown that on average, white Americans respond to this information when you tell them those projections with a sense of worry about losing social, political, and or cultural status or centrality in the country. Okay? And you see this in recent data by Pew, where roughly 50% of white Americans say that this change, such a majority-minority future, will actually weaken American culture. Okay. We also know that this broad constellation, these racial group status threats, tend to trigger all kinds of other downstream consequences, some of which are truly, upsetting, right? The expression of more racial animus, broadly more support for conservative policies, and these are on things that are race-related, like immigration policy and affirmative action, but also on a host of other issues that are not race-related, such as tax policy or defense spending. Okay? And one of the others that stands out in our work is that it also increases concern about the presence of anti-white discrimination. In fact, we recently saw a march on Washington, that was meant to highlight the question of, are whites now the new minority, both numerically and in terms of status? Okay? So obviously, these have implications of themselves, but I think it's important to think about what the implications of these outcomes in the wake of these shifting demographics have for racial economic equality. Okay? So one, besides their direct implications, I think it's important to think about how these shifts are creating and sustaining our narratives about societal progress. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, I've been doing some work, more theoretical work, lately about what I'm calling our mythology of racial progress. And it goes something like this. This is in our heads, right? In our country, so those of you who enjoy graphs, you're going to spend a lot of time with me. I love graphs. Okay. So those of you who don't, you're going to love graphs by the end of this. So on the y-axis, you'll see, there's some concept of racial equality in our nation. Oh, they don't have this one. Is there a way to put the slides on this one? Okay, sorry. Yeah, only this one. There's some amount of racial equality in society, and in our past, it was, nil, right? Really bad, right? But, sometimes that starts in slavery for people. For others, it starts, we think about Jim Crow, but there were landmark, legislations, Brown cases, Brown versus the board, that changed the trajectory and we then we're now on this sort of proceeding, ascending movement towards racial equality, right? For some, it was the election of Barack Obama, right? That was the inflection point. Maybe they're both in there. But we feel like, okay, we're on the right track, and our society is naturally, if not automatically, moving in this direction, right? So the question is, what to make of this majority-minority shift? What will that do? Well, for some people, they think, yeah, it'll continue us on. In fact, this is critical to engendering racial tolerance and justice. Our data suggests actually it's going to be a little more complicated, and it's likely to undermine if there was any natural automatic path towards racial equality, although I think there never was one, right? But either way, it's important to think about how these shifts in terms of racial demographics of the nation are shaping our narrative of racial progress, and in ways that, make us step back and ask, what are people in this moment of incredible demographic change, and in some ways identity instability? How are they, understanding the current state of racial economic inequality, right? Do people even know what is currently the case? So I want to spend some time talking about the work we've been doing on how Americans think about and how they perceive racial economic inequality. And I want to convince you, I hope to convince you, of a couple things. The most important is that people are largely ignorant to the actual state of racial economic inequality in the nation. And two, part of it is because people are really committed to this narrative of racial progress. Okay? So let me show you some data. But this is just going to show you a bunch of data. Thank you. This is so helpful. You're so wonderful. Some data that we've been collecting. This is from a set of studies, but they generally look like this. We'll ask people just a simple question: for every $100 of annual income that the average white family has today, how much annual income does the average black family have today? Okay, and they'll do it today. Then they'll do it sometime in the past. Okay. And the items look something like this. So, there's no like math involved, really. It's just a slider, right? So we tell them that 100 indicates racial equality. So if you think that relative to whites, blacks have as much, you want to put the slider at 100. If you think blacks have much more than whites, you put it at 200. If you think they have nothing, you put it at 0. Okay, you guys see where we are? Excellent. Okay, so we did this with income, also perceptions of wealth equality, perceptions of gaps in wages between blacks and whites who have high school degrees, who have college degrees, gaps in healthcare coverage, right? A range of markers of economic well-being. So what I'm going to show you is data on these perceptions sometime in the past, which was, in the 70s here, today, which at the time we did it was 2013, the date that we had the most recent national data, federal statistics, okay, for a composite measure of economic well-being. Okay? So on the y-axis, what we have is people's perceptions of inequality, okay, or equality, I should say it that way, because that's how it's phrased. But it's subtracted from those perceptions are the national data. So what is so? Okay, so these are largely overestimates of the extent to which society has achieved racial economic equality. That's higher numbers. Numbers below the horizontal axis, 0, mean people are too pessimistic, right? They're overestimating the state of economic inequality, all right? So I'm just gonna show you data across 3 studies because they're all largely the same. People are generally accurate about how unequal or how equal society was in the past, okay? But they're wildly inaccurate about the current state of racial economic equality, right? Shockingly so, okay? And what you can see from these data is that there's this sense that surely things must have gotten better, right? Surely they've gotten better, right? And they have on some markers, but not all, okay? But not as much as people believe, okay? So that's 2 time points, which is, enough to make a line. You guys learned that in one of those classes, geometry, right? One of them. I don't know, I think it was on the SATs. But we want to look at this more closely across multiple time points and specifically regarding wealth, because we know wealth is the most important economic marker, right? Wealth is what allows us to withstand shocks, unexpected expenses for any kind, healthcare costs, right? Anything, right? So we did this, again, same type of question, just with wealth specifically, and the same slider. We now had the national data in 2016, so we could use that as our measure. So we had judgments at 2016 and then all the way to 1963, okay? And they made 12 judgments across this period, randomly presented, okay? 100 still means equality. So in this graph, I'm going to show you the people's perceptions of the current state of economic or wealth equality, black-white wealth equality, in the yellow, there'll be yellow dots in line, and then show you reality, right? What national data say is the case, okay? So this is people's perceptions on average, okay? So again, thinking that surely this gap has closed, meaning, on average, Black Americans have today about almost 90% of the wealth that white Americans have, right? Thinking the gap is closed. This is reality, okay? So again, you can see 2 things. 1, people are more accurate about today than they were, about the past than they are today, but they're shockingly inaccurate, shockingly unaware of the actual state of the situation, okay? Perfect. And I just want to show you, so on the, we also collected estimates from 2016 on perceptions of the Asian white and Latinx white gaps, and you can see that, people are just as inaccurate about this current state of racial economic inequality between whites and Latinos. They're more accurate about the, obviously, current state between Asians and white Americans, but in part because it's closer, right? There's a smaller gap, but they still overestimate equality. Okay, and of course this has implications for what policies we support, right? And who we think is in need of support. Okay. So, I think these data tell us that we, right, Americans, falsely believe that we've largely achieved economic equality. And if we've achieved it, surely what are we spending all this time and work creating programs to do something that we've already achieved, right? So I'm just going to quickly, just a couple minutes left, just say a couple of things. One, we all do this on average, why I'm presenting it this way, but some people do it more than others. Maybe not surprisingly, white Americans are more likely to be inaccurate or overestimate equality than racial minority Americans. High-income Americans are more than their lower-income counterparts. There's just some data demonstrating this with high and low-income white and black Americans. So you see it's really high-income white Americans are shockingly overestimating relative to low-income white Americans and black Americans of either income level, okay? But why, right? Lots of explanations here that I don't have time to go into, but there are some that are also the reasons why we have these gaps to begin with, including racial and socioeconomic segregation, right? We don't encounter people who live differently than we do, certainly not severely. Sometimes we organize our lives so we don't have to encounter people who live very differently from others, right, from us. And so we don't actually have a sense of how much people have and don't have, especially across racial lines. Okay, but I want to leave you with a more provocative one that I don't really have time to get into, but haha, we can chat later. Okay, and this is the case that people kind of do know, and they can know, but we're operating under a state of willful blindness about this stark inequality, right? And there are many reasons why. I think this narrative of racial progress is one. Our narratives about American dream is another. We are so committed to this idea that we are unwilling to recognize the severe structural inequalities that make the American dream so actually not possible for so many people. And a correlate of that is this sort of belief, it's a psychological construct called a belief in a just world. And this is the idea, again, that there are actually not severe structural barriers that impede our success, right? So these are some of the items. I believe that by and large, people get what they deserve. I'm confident that justice always prevails over injustice. I firmly believe that injustices in all areas of life are the exception rather than the rule. And blessed be those for whom that is true. So if you look at the same data I provided, this is from that first study I showed you, by separately for Black and white Americans. This is how estimates of racial economic equality. Okay, and what you can see is that both Black Americans and white Americans, the more they believe that society is fair and just, the more they overestimate equality. Right? We really are motivated to see society as fair, okay? Even when it's not, okay? So I want us to think about the ways in which we are currently being willfully blind to the inequality around us. In some ways, this is both the underside of that beautiful piece on gratitude. Being grateful for being in this extraordinary place also means recognizing its extraordinary affluence. It also means not habituating, getting numb to the inequality that we see all the time around us. I live just outside of New Haven, Connecticut, and part of this work was partly motivated by moving to a new place where I had not become blind to the inequality around me, right? So I invite us to do that also, maybe in the service of generating more gratitude. So just to close, I want to say, let's try to live in reality and not mythology, because we know this is the reality, right? These inequalities, especially on wealth, they lead to every other inequality. They are sustained by every other form of inequality, and ones that really matter for this two-generation approach. We can't reduce this inequality or any other if we're not willing to acknowledge it. Just want to thank my collaborators on this work and you for listening. All more information, you can email me, you can hit me up on Twitter, you can go to my website. Thank you all so much.
It was fantastic.
Good morning. It is really a pleasure to be here with you. I am going to, in my remarks, make 3 key points. First, the racial wealth gap is not the result of inadvisable financial choices by people of color. Rather, the racial wealth gap was created through structural racism. 2, structural barriers in the labor market have further exacerbated the racial wealth gap. And 3, the racial wealth gap can be closed, but it will require bold, equitable solutions that focus on policy change, not changing people's behavior. So, wealth is what you own minus what you owe. If income is a flow of resources, wealth is the stock. Wealth allows families to take care of emergencies like cars that break down, sustain the family during periods when the flow of income declines or stops, such as when a person loses their job. Wealth allows families to make investments in higher education, a home, a business, retirement savings. The racial wealth gap is the disparity in net worth between families of color and white families. The median wealth of white families in 2016 was 10 times the wealth of Black families and 8 times the wealth of Latinx families, and this gap has grown over time. The gap in the dollar amount of wealth also grows with age. White families accumulate more wealth over their lifetime than African American or Latinx families. White household heads in their 30s have a median wealth that is about $87,000 more than African Americans. By the time that they are in their 70s, however, white household heads have a median wealth that is about $271,000 more than older African Americans. This slide shows wages over a lifetime on average. White men have been paid substantially more than African American and Latinx men and women. Now, often when researchers present these kinds of disparities, they stop there without examining the root causes of these differences. And they either leave it to the reader to mistakenly conclude that the disparities are due to individuals making poor financial choices, or in some cases, researchers include this faulty assumption in their research reports. The racial wealth gap is not the result of poor financial choices on the part of people of color, nor did it happen accidentally. Research demonstrates that the racial wealth gap was created through structural racism, and this includes policies, programs, and institutional practices that were designed to facilitate the wealth accumulation by white families while creating barriers to the accumulation of wealth or stripping wealth from families of color. For Black families, these policies began with the human trafficking and bondage of people of African descent. Centuries of systemic racism followed this. Black students were prohibited from attending white schools and universities. The Black Codes prohibited Black people from operating lucrative businesses and restricted Black people to menial jobs. Violent attacks on Black people and communities by white mobs destroyed individual and community assets. Racially restrictive covenants prevented Black families from buying white-owned homes, and Black neighborhoods were starved of investment through redlining or decimated by urban renewal without adequate compensation or relocation. Latinx families experienced extensive land loss in the 1800s during the Manifest Destiny period. And while Mexicans were encouraged to come to the US during the wars to fill labor shortages, thousands were subsequently deported, particularly in the 1950s. Native Americans lost much of their land and natural resources through wars, treaties, and forced displacement. And this includes the Homestead Act of 1862 that allowed white male citizens to claim up to 160 acres of government-surveyed land in the West and displace the Sioux, Cheyenne, Ute, Pawnee, and other Native people. Asian Americans began to immigrate to the US in the 1840s, but during the gold rush in California, special fees, taxes, and regulations were applied to Chinese miners to make them less competitive than with white miners. And during World War II, Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps, losing their freedom and their assets. Women's ability to accumulate assets was also restricted. It was not until 1900 that all states enacted legislation allowing women to exercise control over their property. And before the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, women could be fired from a job for becoming pregnant. Current policies and practices continue to block or strip wealth from people of color, and more recently, families of color were targeted for subprime mortgages even when they qualified for prime loans, resulting in a huge loss of home ownership or equity. Current immigration policies and practices have resulted in the deportation of people of color and the loss of their wealth if they had to leave that behind. Lower wealth levels restrict the ability of families of color to buy or hold on to their homes, invest in schools in their neighborhoods, and pass wealth on to their children. Both racial and gender disparities in the labor market exacerbate wealth gaps, and these disparities are not fully explained by levels of education or types of occupation. African American workers experience higher rates of unemployment than white workers at every level of education. And African American workers receive lower wages than white workers at every level of education. African American workers receive lower wages in every occupation. Women of color encounter both gender and racial disparities. African American women have consistently had higher rates of labor market participation than white women, yet they experience higher rates of unemployment than both white men and white women at every level of education. Similarly, African American women are paid lower wages than white men or women at every level of education, and African American women are paid less than white men and Black men and less than white women in every occupation. The Institute of Women's Policy Research estimated that if change continues at the same slow pace as it has done for the past 50 years, it will take 40 years or until 2059 for women to reach pay equity. For Black women, it will take a century. These employment and wage disparities are not the result of individual failures. Discrimination and segregation in hiring, pay, and employment were common and largely legal practices until the 1960s when civil rights legislation outlawed employment discrimination. But despite this legislation, as we've just seen, the discriminatory practices persist. The consequences of labor market barriers make it harder for people of color to obtain pension coverage or save for retirement. But it is important to note that when workers of color and white workers have similar circumstances, they make similar choices regarding participation in retirement plans and contribution levels. Researchers found no significant difference in the participation rates or contribution levels to 401k plans between workers of color and white workers after controlling for job tenure, education, income, and assets. Moreover, researchers in 2016 showed that among workers with earnings of $75,000 or more, African American workers participate in employer-sponsored retirement savings plans at a higher rate than white workers. But given the systemic barriers at play, people of color often do not have circumstances that are similar to white people, and consequently, as we saw on the previous slide, older African Americans do not have the level of retirement savings held by white seniors on average. A common misperception is that the racial wealth gap can be closed by changing the financial behaviors of individual consumers. But the racial wealth gap is driven by structural racism and structural barriers in the labor market, not individual behaviors or choices. And it persists even when Black families make all of the right choices. Black people with college degrees have less wealth than white high school dropouts. Black people who work full-time have less wealth than white people who are unemployed. And two-parent Black families have less wealth than single-parent white families. The Ford Foundation funded the first research that was specifically designed to measure the racial wealth gap in several cities and to disaggregate the data not only by race and ethnicity, but also by country of origin and by tribal affiliation. As a result, the asset holdings of Latinx families could be measured separately for families of Cuban, Mexican, South American, Puerto Rican, and Dominican ancestry. This disaggregation also was designed for Black, Asian American, and Native American families. The research shows vast disparities in wealth holdings by these characteristics compared to white families, and differences by geographic location. The research provided critical information, but it was limited to 6 metropolitan areas and only for 1 year. There is a need for data to be collected in more places across the country and for data to be collected periodically to enhance the ability of scholars to better understand the drivers of the racial wealth gap and to inform policymakers of the kinds of legislative levers that could eliminate the racial wealth gap. One possible approach is to have the Federal Reserve Board expand the survey of household economic decision-making or the survey of consumer finance. Another possibility is for place-based organizations to partner with research and policy organizations to replicate the racial wealth gap survey that looked at the 6 metropolitan areas. This approach could enhance the studies by having place-based data collected and by having place-based organizations have input into the interpretation of data and the reporting of the results, as well as the dissemination of the results. The racial wealth gap is not an unsolvable problem, but requires bold and equitable policy solutions to eliminate it. One bold solution has been proposed by Derek Hamilton, who is the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Dr. Hamilton's model of baby bonds would provide all newborns with a publicly funded endowment ranging from $500 to $60,000. A baby born into a low-wealth family would receive a substantially higher endowment than one born into an affluent family. Hamilton conceived of baby bonds as public trust accounts held by the federal government until the child becomes a young adult. The young adult could then use the endowment to pay for higher education or a home or to start a business. The money could not be used for consumption. Hamilton's rationale is that everyone in a capitalist system should have some seed capital, and that the lack of capital perpetuates inequity. One analysis showed that baby bonds nearly closed the racial wealth gap. Currently, the median wealth of young white adults is 15 times that of young black adults. But under baby bonds, young white adults would have about 1.6 times the wealth of young black adults. Baby bonds are a multi-generational approach to economic equity. The cost of baby bonds could be covered by a more equitable distribution of existing tax subsidies for asset building. Research by the Urban Institute shows that in 2013, the federal government spent almost $385 billion to provide tax subsidies to help families build wealth. However, approximately 70% of asset building tax subsidies for the home mortgage interest deduction and the deduction for property taxes goes to households in the top 20% of the income bracket. If the mortgage interest rate deduction was more limited and savings could be used to cover the cost, these savings could be used to cover the cost of baby bonds. So in summary, the racial wealth gap is caused by discriminatory policies and practices, not poor financial decision-making. Structural barriers in the labor market further exacerbate the racial wealth gap, and a bold, equitable policy solution such as baby bonds is needed to close this wealth gap. And a more equitable distribution of existing tax subsidies for asset building could pay for them. And then finally, these are some of the papers that I used to prepare my remarks, and they've been uploaded to the app if you're interested. Thank you.
Wow, so I'm humbled to be here. My presentation will be less graphics, more reflections. And before I launch in, I just want to tell you about where I'm coming from. I'm a first-generation American. My parents are from Nigeria. I lived in Georgia, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Hawaii, Massachusetts, and then landed in New York finally. That actually allows me to be optimistic in times of difficult times, chaos. So before I launch in also, I want to note a word for this conversation, and that is abundance. A reminder that when we speak about disparities and inequities, what lies on the other side of that conversation is the abundance of culture, relationships, social and human capital, and other resources that really constitute wealth. But there are the sad statistics that the data shows us, some of which we've heard already. New York City, as an example, has struggled for decades to effectively and equitably respond to health needs of mothers of color. Troubling data from the health department shows that birth outcomes for Black and Latina mothers and babies are significantly worse than white mothers and babies. Compared to white mothers and babies, Black mothers are 8 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. Black women are 3 times more likely to suffer life-threatening complications associated with delivery. And babies of Black and Latina mothers are more likely to die before their first birthday. How can one achieve prosperity when survival is hard enough? And who is accountable? Indigenous communities struggle deeply with equally troubling outcomes that come to bear across a variety of systems, but are born out of centuries of colonialism, racism, and destructive policies that have eaten away at the cultural traditions that have given them life. Native youth are 5 times more likely to be placed in the criminal justice system. Native youth commit suicide at 2.5 times higher than the national average. 81% of Native men experience violence in their lifetime. 84% of Native women experience violence in their lifetime. And Native children are overrepresented in the foster care system at more than 2.6 times the expected level. A colleague of mine made clear a point to me recently, that these outcomes among indigenous communities and communities of color, rural communities and dense urban centers with growing poor populations manifest because they are invisible. Invisible in the data and the research that's being collected, invisible in the leadership meant to advocate and speak on their behalf, and invisible in the financial systems. Furthermore, as my colleague Dr. Stephanie Freiberg noted, this allows space for toxic stereotypes and misperceptions that feed into the cycle of exclusion, blame, and invisibility. And I want to note that Dr. Stephanie Freiberg is one of the only 2 Native American social psychologists in the country, and of those 2, the one focused on Native research. Let's talk quickly about geography and how that affects the ability of children and families to thrive. The South is the largest region of the country and is growing at exponential rates, but outcomes for children and families are measured at the bottom, 10. So you'll see these are 10 southern states: Georgia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi that rank at the bottom 10 in child well-being metrics. What I should point out is Texas is not on that list. And yet, when you look closely at the data, this is administrative data, there are significant differences in outcomes across racial, ethnic, and class lines that become clear when assessed at the city, county, and neighborhood level. Based on a report in 2017, between as much as 60% of children in the East Side neighborhood of San Antonio experience the effects of poverty and some of the highest rates of confirmed cases of child abuse and neglect. It won't surprise you that the East Side neighborhood is predominantly Latinx. And these outcomes are a result of structural racism. While broken and siloed systems and willfully neglectful leaders have a share in the blame game, so too does philanthropy. Not only are there fewer dollars directed to programs and services in the South, even fewer dollars are directed towards structural change work that often is led by local advocacy groups and grassroots organizations. I'm going to pivot for a moment again. The Doris Duke Foundation over the last 10 years has funded 120 emerging researchers around the country. And this is big R research. They're doing research around issues related to child well-being broadly, but are focusing in public health, psychology, economics, history, sociology, and beyond. And while they're successful in their own right, they've achieved success in their careers, have received additional funding for their research, they've achieved leadership positions, and have been well published. What we did note after reflecting on this pool of researchers, only 20% were people of color. And of that small subset of researchers, they are the ones who are actually intentionally tackling issues related to equality. So we've got these 4 young researchers here as an example, but we know that we need to do more and we need to do better. We also need to interrogate the value of research, given the mountains of data that already exists out there. We know that research matters, but how that research is conducted and communicated matters equally. We need to ask and interrogate what the value of research is. Who's leading the research? How do they connect themselves to the work? Is it a them or is it an us? Who is the research for? Is it to inform, to improve, or to divide and show differences? Who is part of the research? Does the sample include a racially and ethnically diverse mix where relevant? And if it doesn't, is it generalizable? Who has access to the data? Who gets credit for the research? The researcher, the participants, the community? And how do we communicate outcomes? Is it shame and blame? What about context? How do we contextualize those outcomes in this context based on what we've heard today and what we know out there in the world? So recognizing some of the gaps in research and knowing that we wanted to make true actionable change, our program reoriented our investments to direct our funding towards backbone organizations, many of which are represented in this room today, and support them in developing deep, meaningful partnerships with local organizations, research institutions, and residents at the helm and at the center to lead a common agenda of work that is responding to issues centered around children and families, to work together to develop mutually reinforcing activities that are multi-generational at their heart. They develop a shared measurement plan drawing on existing data and gathering new data where necessary. They work to mobilize funding, both from federal, state, local resources, as well as philanthropy. And they embed within that work continuous communications to hold themselves accountable. This also fuels an environment where failure is okay. Course correction is expected. And when those course corrections aren't made, it's clear who's to be held accountable. So I want to give you two examples of some of that work. COA Youth and Family Services, which is based in Milwaukee, serves as the backbone institution in 3 of the most violent neighborhoods on the north side of Milwaukee. And they've been doing this work, this collective impact work, for several years, but really ramped up that effort over the last 5 years. And so they're doing it's a multi-pronged approach, but one of the most critical outcomes of this work is a reduction in crime in those neighborhoods by 44% in 5 years. You can imagine what that does to the well-being of a family and a child, what that means for reducing toxic stress, for really thinking about how to live your life beyond fear. This initiative has noted reduced effects of trauma, measurable, and stress in the communities, a more positive neighborhood identity, and, importantly, reinvestment by local philanthropy and businesses in this neighborhood. Stores have opened. There's healthier food available because there's an opportunity now. And this will no doubt affect future generations in the neighborhood. Another quick example, this is the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation that works on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Pine Ridge is home to nearly 35,000 people, primarily Native American, and has one of the weakest economies and some of the weakest infrastructure in the developed world. I also hold a portfolio around African health systems, and the outcomes on Pine Ridge look the same as in Rwanda. And the last, they've done, again, this collective impact approach, and just one example that is pictured here is support of new housing on the reservation. And the way that they did that was by providing workforce development and apprenticeship support for natives on the reservation to build their own homes. In the last 4 years, over $15 million in external funding from government agencies, private sector, and philanthropy have been invested in the reservation. This is exponential growth. But this all reminds me that enabling the redistribution of power, that is, centering our investments on the residents and local communities, can result in the redistribution of financial wealth and a recognition of wealth beyond dollars. As I noted earlier, we started expanding our thinking about wealth and prosperity. We need to start thinking about rethinking wealth and prosperity. And Edgar Villanueva, author of Decolonizing Wealth, which many of us are familiar with, and other colleagues have shed light on this issue. There's a critical need to reimagine and realign wealth according to our values. Now is the time for that. And in fact, communities of color store far more wealth than they get credit for. Consider this. Black families, you'll see in this chart, contributed the largest proportion of their assets to charity. This does not account for the other sources of wealth, including knowledge and wisdom sharing, time spent mentoring, and volunteering. Redefining wealth requires that we recognize the abundance that exists, that there will be more, that collaboration, not competition, is key. Generosity, not hoarding resources, can feed success, that thinking big and embracing risk is critical. So with that, we've landed, in addition to supporting local communities, on this issue of leadership, that we need to invest in a new generation of leaders who can think critically, who have a vision to take place, But if real change is to take place, if this movement that we're talking about is to endure, we have to invest in community organizers that have a vision to take them through to the end, that they have an inquisitive mind and a spirit, and they can work with researchers, that they have that compassion that's essential to really do good work for the families that need it the most, that they're willing to disrupt the conversation, that they have the skills to tell stories in a way that's compelling to their communities, but to the decision makers locally and at the top, that they're problem solvers, that they're entrepreneurs and have support to build new things and new ways of working, and that their ability to network and partner when the opportunity presents itself is essential. So I'll close with that, and I look forward to future conversations.
Fantastic. Well, we have just had a wealth of wonderful presentations and information. I think it'd be fantastic to go to conversation. And so to try to get as many kind of questions in, I'd love it if people, we're going to just go straight to questions. If people could sort of have a short question and then also remember to introduce yourself would be wonderful. So I think someone's walking around with a mic. So let's, come on, do you mind coming on down? Let's start in the middle and then we'll cruise over there. And so start with Trinae and then we're gonna hop over that way just so we can keep it moving. So don't be shy, just keep your hand up so we can, so people, the mic runners can, oh sorry, okay, go boom, boom, okay.
Thank you guys so much. So my
And
name
you
is
are?
Trinae
Thank you.
Hawkins. You're welcome, Ann. So of course the focus of this work and what Aspen brings to the table is focus on family voice. You as researchers know that a lot of how we think about what we consider valid evidence comes from folks who are well credentialed, associated with institutions. So how do you make these two pieces dovetail in terms of how we think about holding up perspectives, experiences, stories we get from families as evidence?
I'll start. We are listeners. So in fact, we don't actually go to researchers to develop questions. We go to the community to set up those questions and ask if they work with researchers to make the design rigorous. That's one point. The second point I'd like to add is research is my background. I'm now a consumer of research. And I know the limitations of research. So we're not actually trying to pursue new evidence and new research when we already know the reality on the ground. So we make decisions about what's necessary, what's known and unknown. My colleagues here are the wisdom in the room, and so we draw a lot on what exists.
I just add to that by saying when you review research, consume research, you don't have to just accept what you see on the page. If it doesn't feel right to you, if it doesn't resonate with what you know from your experience or the communities you work in, contact the researcher. Question them about how they're conducting their research. Ask them why they're not looking at root causes, why they're not looking at systemic barriers. You don't have to just assume that they know best and accept it.
Yeah, I'll just add one small point, which is sort of, I guess, the embodiment of who I am. One of the reasons why I do the work I do, both in my own scholarship, but also in the mentoring that Ann mentioned, is because we need scholars of color who are from these communities doing this work. And, you know, I mean, that's really what I've been doing my whole career, trying to use the tools of, you know, and the shiny baubles, whether it's MacArthur, whatever one, that, you know, comes with some unearned legitimacy to say, okay, now let me tell you something. And I can say it in the language, in a language that can be heard in many constituencies, and sometimes it's, you know, you say it slightly differently, just different groups, but it always, my work always starts from conversations and a real embeddedness in the communities that are
it's about and that it's for. So I think it's also investing in scholars like my good friend Stephanie Freiberg, who are trying to do this work in academia that also, actually, not that you surprised those of you who are in there, but they don't value us. They don't want us to disrupt the narratives that are convenient by providing evidence that suggests those narratives are not right. So, you know, I think that's also a piece of it.
Good morning. My name is Marla Dean, and I'm from Washington, D.C., Bright Beginnings. We run two-generation early child and adult learning programs for families experiencing homelessness. So the context of Washington, D.C., when you talk about the wealth gap, is
Quick question.
ridiculous. So
Love you
83
and
times
love you.
between white and black.
Yeah.
My question to you specifically about willful blindness and nonprofit boards. Because so many of them are the people that have the willful blindness. Where is the work going to happen to educate that population so that those of us who lead these organizations can have more truthful, honest, real conversations and really address these issues more systemically?
Yeah, wow, thank you for the
Thank you.
question.
If you go to Vicki next, back there. Great.
Should I? Yeah. So yeah, I think again that's why we're doing this work. You know, I'm shocked every time someone says they don't realize how big the racial wealth gap is nationally, but even in these communities, despite the knowledge being out there, right? So we're not creating new markers, new measures, whatever. We're just demonstrating that people don't know and trying to unearth the psychology that allows us to sustain ourselves, whether we're working in the very domains in which it matters, living in the communities where the disparities are in your face, or not, right? How do we help people? How do we take them the next step? So that's why we're trying to do this work, and that's why we're also hoping to intervene in these places of influencers who somehow are still defaulting to the explanations that we know are not true. Oh, let's just teach people, you know, how to manage their money, right? That's like the metaphor I like. That's like teaching people how to swim just enough and then saying, okay, now swim the English Channel. It's like, no, that's not, you know, that's not going to get us there.
But it also goes back to what was the previous answer that you provided, Jennifer. And also to the slide that you showed of all of the researchers that were being funded. When I was at Ford and working on asset building and I just started there, I would look around the table and say, where are the people of color? The communities that we're talking about impacting are people of color, and the decision makers should be as well. And the answer was always, you know, the pool is so small, there's just so few. So the work that we did, and that, first of all, that's not true, but the work that we did was to identify who was out there, who had expertise in economic security and asset building and other areas, and to start bringing them together. And every year we brought them together and brought more of them together until we had hundreds of these experts of color from all of the communities of color who were then in a position to serve as experts on boards, to give testimony, to write op-eds, to be interviewed by the New York Times. Derek Hamilton, who I mentioned, is one of those people who grew out of the experts of color and also had done a lot of work prior to that as well. But it's a matter of, one, being persistent, and two, these folks just need access and resources to really break open the tables where decisions are being made, the rooms where research designs are being created, and the places where all of this reporting is being done, and to give a different perspective.
Vicki?
Thank you. Vicki Shabo from New America, which is a think tank in DC. And I was really struck also, Jennifer, by your research and the gap between, the implications for the gap between perception and reality, and what we can be doing to educate and change hearts and minds about these structural barriers and the implications of those structural barriers. So I guess my question is sort of what conversations or interventions are you thinking about, or should we be thinking about, in terms of public education, marketing, influencer, and spokespeople and leadership campaigns that really do bring to light that chasm between perception and reality when it comes to income and wealth, and how we use that to start shaping, I guess, or building will for new public investments that start to correct structural barriers. So whether it's baby bonds or other forms of income assistance or housing assistance or transportation or paid family and medical leave, which I work on, there's a host of things that need to be invested in. And it seems like what you've identified is a big piece of where the problems lie. So.
Yeah. Thank you. And then if you can go prepared over to Veronica next.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great question. I wish I had those answers, but I have a couple things that we know don't automatically work. So one is because I was like, well, if people just really knew or convinced of the continuing legacy of discrimination from, pick a anchor, the 60s or, to now, surely that would at least bring them closer. No, it actually doesn't. They maintain their belief that current society is fair. And oddly, they adjust their perceptions of the past to say, oh, well, it must not have been that bad then, if things were, if there's this continuing legacy of discrimination. So, I mean, I'm a psychologist. The mind is an incredibly lovely, wonderful, bizarre thing. But oh my goodness, the gymnastics we, engage in to maintain this belief that we've achieved equity. So that doesn't work, which is why I've moved to, we need to go back a step to what are these narratives that we hold so dearly and true that we're willing to not even acknowledge the reality that's in our faces for many of us day after day, that they're just vast inequalities. And so that's where I've tried to move to step back and say, no, I know we want our society to be fair and just, but we haven't achieved it. None of the markers of success that we champion in our great story of this nation, they haven't done it. And for many markers, they haven't closed it at all. And we need to tell them the truth and then let ourselves sit in that discomfort. I think that's the first step, because that is what motivates us to then do something about it. To say, this is where we are, and it's not acceptable.
So we're getting ready to get near closing comments, and because I want to make sure we have time for break, and we're going to have lots more time. We're moving into time for workshops and interactions. And so I'm going to ask Veronica to ask one more question, and if to keep it short, and then I'm going to sort of we're going to do quick answers to that, and then I'm going to pose kind of a last question to set you all up for your closing comments, and then we'll have a chance to go into break. So Veronica, if you can introduce yourself.
Veronica Fioli, Denver Public Schools Foundation, and an Aspen Ascend Fellow. What can K-12 do to create a stronger pipeline into academia?
Is this stuff for me? Is this because I coughed on stage all night? Wow. I'm going to give the honest answer. I don't know, but I'll tell you one thing that would benefit K through 12, that would create a stronger pipeline, and that is more equitable investment in public education, which we know is one of the main structural barriers that makes it difficult for people to get to college, much less post-secondary education. So. It's probably not a satisfactory answer, but I think that would be the biggest system change, structural change. And we see right now communities going the other way, where they're breaking off. Wealthier white communities are breaking off from their poorer neighbors that used to be in the same school district. They're cordoning themselves off, right? I mean, we're residential segregation, school segregation. We're where we were 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I would say, in addition to, I would wholeheartedly agree with more equitable financing of schools. And in addition, going back to last night, I would say opening up schools to parents and encouraging parents to be a part of the education that their children are receiving, and to be recognized as experts, not outsiders that have to be kept away, but as experts who should be brought into the classroom and participate in the education of their children.
Actually, sorry, one more question that's actually more useful answer. Demand that whatever university is near you invests in the school. Not just taking from the school. There's probably some developmental site researcher that's trying to ask you to, can we test your kids? Okay, what is this university, what is this college doing for us? Opening up the spaces of academia for kids, having them in our labs, having them come to events, having events for them is what actually does more to demystify college and academia than anything else.
So a couple thoughts I want to put out to all of you as leaders and to this panel, and you can respond to any of it or not, and as you leave everybody with your kind of sort of charged comments. But one thing that was a really important thing about then and now, when I think about when this stage of work started between 2010 and where we are now, is, we owe so much to President Obama and his thoughtful nature. When this work, 2010, when we were in the space of the Great Recession. And, this, it's sort of amazing when we think about the economic consistent growth that we have been on. It has not been equitably felt, distributed, but as a United States of America, and as sort of a private sector goes, record profits, record jobs numbers, very, very strong economic growth. And the Joint Economic Committee is just sort of releasing some numbers, and some new research is coming out, looking at, and my dear friend Aparna out there, I'm looking forward to discussing with you very much, because there's ways to look at sales tax, state tax, income tax, but literally how are we publicly investing in human capital? Baby bonds, parent and adult education, flipping from child to think about like fatherhood, support, and success instead of enforcement and punishment, but like a human capital investment strategy. That, there's like basically the Congressional Budget Office just came out with 300, like we're basically going to post like a $364 trillion deficit this year. And when President Obama left us, I think it was like 600 and change. So that's 300 billion. So Parna, I'm looking forward to talking about this. But I think both for philanthropy, but philanthropy is small, but let's work on it, Lola. But how we're really making this case for how we are investing in children and families in this country, and doing it also really with a racial equity and a gender lens that is going to be really reaching our potential. And I think this mythology work is really profoundly important. And so this willful blindness, when we think about what we've learned around implicit and explicit bias, I wrap around that Socratic method, just take it in. But for all of us here, we have a chance to, how do we support one another to be thinking about who can be helpful messengers, who can be helpful platforms, who can back each other up. So again, this has been a fantastic conversation, and just bring us home phenomenal women.
So that means you.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a surprise. So here's my closing comment kind of on the fly. And what I would say is kind of reiterating an earlier statement that I made. Research doesn't have to be treated as this sacred object that can't be questioned. When I left the Ford Foundation and I wanted to go to the Urban Institute because I highly respected that organization. They had been a grantee. I wanted to do research there, but I also wanted to work with the organization to become more diverse, inclusive, and equitable, not just in terms of its staffing, but also in terms of the content of its research and the way that we communicate the research, that is done with respect for the communities that we are addressing, and also the audiences that we attract, that we need to get our research into the hands of the communities who have allowed us to come in and gather information. And then we also need to involve those communities in doing the research so that it really reflects their reality. And so I guess my closing thought is that when you are looking at research, you're an expert. You know your communities, you know your experience. Critique it, you know how to get in touch with organizations and researchers who are doing it, give them your critiques and hold them accountable.
I agree. Although my research is not for criticism. No, I absolutely agree. I think that, you know, I think, Anne, you said that none of us could make any dent in any of these issues alone. And truly recognizing the need for partnerships broadly. I mean, really just I think of it like a tight web safety net to really do the work with rigor. We have a certain skill set for that, but with integrity. It requires all of us, all the voices, especially the stakeholders in the work. And it depends, obviously we're all that too, but if you're looking at evaluations of the two-generation programs, from whose perspective is this working? On what markers? You know, I often get asked to evaluate all kinds of programs, including some implicit bias training, and I'm like, well, yes, it quote unquote worked on this marker, but what about these other ones? And why, you know, one of my big pet peeves, sorry, I'm going in another direction, about some of these exploratory, experimental investments in communities is, you know, well, whose communities do we think, you know, we can sit around and wait until we have the results of some study to tell us what they need, right? It's, you know, let's try to fix what it is and then sort of, you know, back up and kind of get a sense of what we might have done differently. And I think that we, you know, knowing who's in the room and demanding that the room reflect in whose interest this work is being conducted is, you know, really would go a long way to disrupting some of these narratives and worse, poor interpretations of the disparities that we already know exist.
Just 2 points. One, I think we have to hold researchers accountable for communicating in a way that's actually accessible to regular folks. That's one. And the second is, you know, stories are important. When you read the newspaper, and a policymaker is being told what he didn't do or what she didn't do, that's what they respond to. That's when change happens. Mm-hmm. So capitalizing on social media, journalists, and other outlets to communicate what we know already exists and empowering people of color to tell those stories will be really the way out of this.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Please join me in thanking and honoring and appreciating Kilolo Kiyojaksi, Jennifer Richardson, and Lola Adedokin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I am here to give you guidance on where to go next. And we do have a half-hour break for you to get some refreshments, some coffee, and take a walk to one of your meetings. So we have 8 deep dive breakout sessions scheduled this morning. Some of you have been on this campus before, others have not. So I'm just going to briefly go through where these meeting rooms are, and we will have staff along the paths to guide you as well. Here in the Duer-Hosier building, here in this room, we will have the philanthropic partnership session, so you can stay here if you're planning to attend that. Downstairs in the Kaufman room, we have a terrific session on families and the changing workplace. And then upstairs in the Cato room is our session on fighting mental health stigma. The Koch building is down the path. It's about an 8 to 10 minute walk. And in that building, in the Lauder room, is our narratives and numbers session. And in the Stranahan room is the Behind the Aces pyramid session. And in the Booz Allen Hamilton room is the Superpowers Wanted session. So that is all in that building, and you'll see it straight down the path and to the left. Across the path from that building is the Pepke Library. And in that building is the Justice and Post-Secondary System session. And then finally, last but not least, is our Family Voices for Family Policies session. That's in the Hines Room in the Kresge building, which is just up the path and to the left. It's about a 4-minute walk. It's actually in the basement of one of the buildings with rooms in it, and there will be a sign out front. So please go roll up your sleeves, connect with some new people. We will meet back here at 12:45 for a networking lunch. This is not programmed. We'll have tables outside and on the roof to enjoy the beautiful day. So thank you all, and see you in a little bit.